What is up, everybody? That was, quite simply, the greatest game of the history of Major League Soccer. Still trying to process everything that just happened at Bank of California Stadium. But in the end, LAFC are MLS Cup champions for the first time, winning in a shootout over the Philadelphia Union. So much to break down. I'm going to try and keep this rather quick and focused on a few main points because you could talk about this game forever. It's going to go down in the history books because I'm still not entirely sure what just happened. The first thing I want to focus on, though, is particularly in the first half, but just in general, the way this game played out. Because it was in many ways the opposite of the previous meetings between these teams. The Union had gone into Bank of California Stadium earlier this season in that 3-3 right before the pandemic and done what the Union usually do, which is give the other team possession, don't have much of the actual play. They just create a couple really good chances on the counter and take them. And they're very comfortable doing that, and it's in the past it has messed with LAFC. It's part of what makes this a difficult matchup for LAFC. In this game, the Union were the team with the possession. LAFC managed to find a way to give the Union the ball while playing at home, which is something I didn't think they were going to be able to do. And is a testament to Steve Cherundolo and this team's ability to adapt. I'm going to get to more of that a little bit later, but all of a sudden the Union had the ball, and the Union don't always know what to do with it because they're not trying to play a possession-based game. So you had the exact opposite, where LAFC were the team, didn't have much of the overall play, weren't getting that many chances, but you get opportunities like the free kick, Kellen Acosta finds a way to get into the back of the net, and all of a sudden you're winning, which again is the exact opposite, where the Union have scored first goal, second goal, third goal in that game right before the pandemic, and then allowed one very quickly after, and scored first, and then LAFC equalized, and then the Union went ahead again, and then LAFC equalized again when they met earlier this season. This time, it was the opposite. The Union had to come from behind twice. It played out exactly like you would expect in terms of what you saw on the field, in terms of the chaos and the high level, and it was everything you were expecting between these two teams. Except that it didn't follow the pattern of previous meetings. In many ways, it was the exact opposite. So that's point number one. Point number two. I was waiting and thinking most of this game I was going to come out here and say LAFC didn't get quite enough from their stars. Because of the collective strength of the Union, because of that defense, because of Kai Wagner, because of Andre Blake, the LAFC had to get more out of their stars. And because of the money LAFC have spent to assemble this roster. They had to get more out of their big names or they weren't going to win this game. Because 1 through 11, I'm giving the Union a slight edge. And certainly defensively, giving the Union a significant edge. And 0.25 expected goals combined from that front three that started the game. It's not like things were going particularly well. That goal that Kellen Acosta scored, A, it was Kellen Acosta, not Carlos Vela, who took that free kick. And B, it kind of came out of nothing. It was just a moment that was generated. They did not get enough from the run of play from those starting attackers. And then the Unions also struggled, particularly Ura and Carranza. They didn't make much of an impact. Gazdag was quiet for a while, but then Gazdag pops up with the equalizer, and all of a sudden the Union are getting more out of their front three because of that single moment. And then here comes the series of events that ultimately decided this game. Carlos Vela delivers on the corner to make it 2-1. Gareth Bale comes on for Carlos Vela and saves the game in the dying moments of, I'm going to try and get this right, added time in the second half of extra time. And all of a sudden, you got this slight edge from LAFC. And then Daniel Gazdag slips on his penalty. Unfortunate break, completely turned that penalty shootout around. Who knows what happens if Gazdag gets that first one? And then, by the way, Denny Bouanga, who was not much of a factor, converts his penalty right after that to get LAFC on the right track, and then ultimately John McCarthy comes and delivers. And so Kai Wagner had plenty to say in this game in terms of big names for the Union. Gazdag had his say. The other guy who didn't, outside of one important save to keep it 1-0, Andre Blake. Andre Blake has never been particularly great at saving penalties. There's a reason John McCarthy, who is the hero for LAFC, has also entered penalty shootouts for the Union for that specific purpose. He is an excellent penalty stopper, and Andre Blake is not. And so when you talk about the stars in this game, the ones who ultimately got the edge were LAFC's, and they have an MLS Cup to show for it. It wasn't pretty. It's not like they were spectacular, but they did enough. And they got the help they needed from, you go down the list, Murillo, Acosta, Ilie, Diego Palacios, across the board. They got what they needed so that they didn't have to do everything. And then they did just enough to ultimately decide this game. Third and final main point here. And then I'll talk a little bit about Steve Cherundolo. There is just absolutely nothing between these two teams. I'm not sure you can actually, literally you can. But in a realistic world, I'm not sure you can come closer to winning MLS Cup, winning a championship, and actually failing to do so than the Philadelphia Union did. Here are the list of possible things that could have changed this game, single-handedly. What happens if Maxime Crepeau doesn't get hurt? If Corey Burke doesn't make that play to force the red card and the collision, and what if that collision isn't as serious, and so Crepeau doesn't have to leave the game for one reason or another, be it the red card or the injury? So John McCarthy, Steve Cherundolo said afterward it was something they discussed, but he did not go so far as to say they were going to sub John McCarthy in for that penalty shootout. What happens if Crepeau is in the net instead? And on the injury front, what happens if Alejandro Bedoya plays in this game? Jack McGlynn did a lot of good things. Jack McGlynn also got caught on the ball a few times. In those kind of razor-thin margins, you're telling me a team with Alejandro Bedoya to help navigate some of this chaos, to help stay organized defensively after you go ahead with just minutes remaining, doesn't make the difference? Certainly possible. What happens if Steve Cherundolo doesn't take out Carlos Vela and put in Gareth Bale? Who knows what kind of position people end up in if Vela is still on the field? Now, Cherundolo was saying post-game, Bale has been healthy. He was healthy in Western Conference Final. They just didn't see a need to use him. The plan was to use him if the situation called for it. So that is part of this, that he was probably going to get on the field unless they cruised to a win, and it didn't make sense to bring him on for tactical reasons. But what happens if he doesn't make that sub that quickly? What happens if, Carlos Vela is the one that's trying to get on the end of that header because he's not beating Jack Elliott the way Gareth Bale did? That is the kind of thing Gareth Bale can do for you, that Carlos Vela, as good as he is, can't. What happens, and I've talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning again, what happens if MLS doesn't make wins their tiebreaker? That game is played in Philadelphia. Certainly that could have made the difference between being able to hold on for 5 minutes, winning a penalty shootout, whatever it might have been. And I don't say any of this to discredit or dismiss what LAFC did and the fact they won this game. I say all of this, and part of this is, Steve Cherundolo being proactive by bringing Gareth Bale onto the field and having the courage to take off Carlos Vela when the situation called for it. So not all of this is just things that went wrong for the Union. But I mention all of this just to get to my point and list all these examples of how thin the margin between these two teams is. On another day, the Union win this. If one of these things potentially happens, right? It's not like you need 4 of them for this to go the Union's way. And they also could have just won in the penalty shootout. But on the other side of this, what happens if Jack Elliott doesn't score 2 goals? LAFC were very effective in limiting the Union's best players in this game. There are just so many fine margins because there is, like I said, nothing between these two teams. They were clearly the best 2 teams in the league. One of them ended up with home field advantage because the rules are the rules. That team was ultimately able to win the championship. But the Union have multiple things to point to and were as close as you can possibly be, even without any of those things. I sincerely hope we get this final again. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of team the Union can come back with next season, because it certainly appears there's going to be at least 1 or 2 pieces gone. Jim Curtin has said post-game the goal is to keep everybody try and collect and regroup and get this team back together, but they're really good. People want their players, and for good reason. So maybe we don't get a game quite like this one again. We'll have to see. But those are just some examples that immediately came to mind of things that could have decided this game, because these two teams are just completely equal. And this is the series of events that transpired. They worked out in a way that allowed LAFC to win. Final thing I will say here, and I'm trying to keep this brief. I have mentioned this before, and it showed itself in this game again. And I liked what Steve Cherundolo, another one of the things he said post-game was, I came in and sold the people I needed to on giving me this job by saying you don't change what's working, you don't put effort into that. That's a waste of time. Here are the things I would like to tweak. Here are the areas I want to change. And what he was able to do was to take everything that made this team super successful and add the extra elements that were missing that allow you to succeed in the postseason. LAFC do not win this kind of game with that Bob Bradley team. There is no way. Because they can't win in chaos. They can't win a game where they don't control anything. This LAFC team gave control to the Union and did so as a tactic because the Union also don't want control of games. And then you have the ability to bring on Gareth Bale. You're not reliant on him. He is a luxury you can have coming off your bench that the Union don't. Steve Cherundolo found a way to put all of this together without sacrificing everything that made this team successful and all of the great things he was inheriting, while getting that added dimension, that crucial dimension in there. He deserves a tremendous amount of credit for that. And I don't want that to get glossed over in sort of this overall narrative of, my goodness, look how good this team is. We've been talking about these names since everybody arrived in the, they looked really good from the very beginning of the season. Then all these stars arrived in the summer, and here they are. They always looked like the best team. I still take notion with that, or take an issue with that, but clearly they're phenomenal. These were the 2 best teams in the league. I think you can make an argument for either one. But certainly LAFC deserving champions. But there is part of this that goes beyond just look at all those players and look how good they are. There was the ability to problem solve, the ability to adapt, because if you look at this postseason run, that LA Galaxy game did not really go to plan. Okay, Austin did. But again, that was not necessarily a Bob Bradley style of performance. That was a Steve Cherundolo, this version of LAFC performance that they executed perfectly and got a really easy win as a result. And this game certainly did not go to plan. Okay, you scored the first goal, you scored the second goal. You immediately gave up an equalizer after the second one. You gave up a third one, and your season was within 5 minutes of being over. And Gareth Bale popped up while you're down a man to send it to a penalty shootout against the best goalie in the league, and the guy who the Union were willing to let go came in, who is from Philadelphia, by the way, came in and was phenomenal during a penalty shootout. That's not how Steve Cherundolo drew this thing up. But it's about being prepared and being able to actually adapt to all of these different situations. It is the one criticism I always had of those Bob Bradley teams. It's not going to always go the way you want, especially in the postseason. You have to be able to win multiple ways. You've got to be able to win multiple kinds of games. And it became very clear very quickly in this postseason, LAFC had the ability to do that. Which is, again, also a tremendous credit to the Union, the fact that they showed up and were that competitive and that close to winning, considering what LAFC have done this postseason and the way they showed up. It is not like LAFC have played bad. Certainly today was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But they were still, they're phenomenal. These are two phenomenal teams. They're clearly a class above everybody else. And the final thing I will say, sort of going back to just the unbelievable 130 minutes plus a shootout we just witnessed. This game had all the hype building up ahead of it for good reason, because everybody knew these were the best two teams in the league. Everybody thought this was going to be a great final. This is the final MLS wanted, as in getting our best teams to the championship, which has been a major issue. This felt different than finals of the past. Maybe that Toronto-Seattle, those couple, had some of it, but this was still on a completely different level with the names, the storylines, the tactical differences between these teams. It had everything, and it not only delivered, it exceeded those dramatically high expectations. Which is why, to me, it's at least arguably the best game in league history, but maybe I'm a prisoner of the moment. To me, it's not close. That 3-3 in 2019 was perhaps the most not the best in terms of the stakes and the overall magnitude, but as entertaining as any soccer game I've ever watched. And I've watched plenty. This was more entertaining, and the stakes, of course, were way higher. This was for a championship, for MLS Cup. It's just, you don't get closer to, you have two deserving champions than what ended up happening in MLS this season. They both got there. They both showed up and played phenomenally. It was only fitting it went to a shootout. And somebody, unfortunately, had to lose. And on this day, it was the Philadelphia Union. Congratulations, LAFC. Terrific season. What they have done since joining this league is incredible. You don't see something with that much hype deliver the way they have. Similar to this game itself, that organization has also actually produced on the field by and large. A couple down seasons, but also some of the most dominant seasons in the league's history. And now, finally, the trophy they have been chasing above the rest of them. LAFC, your 2022 MLS Cup champions. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of my content I put out every week. I'll see you next time.